Many people would describe horror and RPGs as two genres that just fundamentally don't mix. These people are wrong. But there is a reason people say this. Horror games are about disempowerment, often alongside tight, immersive design, whereas RPGs tend to be sprawling power fantasies full of numbers and loot drops. On the surface, these two things don't seem compatible, but that surface is a facade. More than anything, RPGs are about embodying a character. Meanwhile, horror is about specific emotions evoked and empathizing with or embodying characters. The most popular genre in tabletop RPGs is fantasy by a long way. Dungeons & Dragons is a pretty big deal. But the second most popular genre isn't sci-fi or cyberpunk or post-apocalyptic, it's horror. At least, it is according to statistics from Roll20 back when they released such things, with Call of Cthulhu also being the second most popular game. And this popularity isn't limited to the West either, as in Japan, Call of Cthulhu is actually the most popular tabletop RPG, outselling even D&D. There is a long, enduring tradition of horror in tabletop RPGs. And why wouldn't there be? Horror provides fertile ground for interesting scenarios and interesting choices. In fact, choice and consequence is sometimes held as the most important part of RPG design, and if that's true, it's hard to think of any genre that fits better than horror. Horror explores a vast range of morally ambiguous scenarios that can ask questions far beyond, do you want to be a good guy or bad guy? But perhaps even more important than explorations of morality are the explorations of mortality. Choices need consequences. Other genres can be scared of this. Players might want power fantasies, and are there primarily to have fun. A DM accidentally wiping the group straight after several hours of setup and character creation would likely be viewed as a bad time. But horror doesn't have this problem. It is that rare genre that is allowed, and often even encouraged, to be truly hostile to players. Wrong decisions don't just lead to less XP, you can lose limbs, lose party members, lose your mind, or lose all of the above in a single encounter, and possibly still keep going, stumbling deeper into the darkness. This synergy also doesn't just go one way. Horror provides RPGs with great choices, but RPG-style choices can also improve horror. After all, horror is a genre about tension. Choices and player agency increase tension, and dire consequences increase that tension even further. This makes choice and consequence a perfect way to heighten key horror emotions, like dread, discomfort, and uncertainty. And this isn't even the only way the two genres synergize. Dungeons & Dragons is misleadingly named because it has a very small focus on dragons compared to its overwhelming focus on dungeons. This is the aspect pioneering developers replicated in the 70s and 80s when computer RPGs first emerged. And there are few environments that lend themselves better to horror than dungeons. The very definition of the word implies a space where someone is imprisoned against their will. Dungeons are places to avoid, places to be trapped, places to dread. Their entire role in RPG design is to create challenges and danger. They are places where resources dwindle, where people get lost, and where you don't know what waits for you around the next corner. Computer RPGs were once all about dungeons, and dungeons can easily be horrifying. And if you're still not convinced, Forget RPGs for a second and look instead to the origins of horror. The two most foundational games to survival horror were Alone in the Dark and Resident Evil. Alone in the Dark began development as an adaptation of Call of Cthulhu, the RPG. Meanwhile, Resident Evil began development as a remake of Sweet Home, also an RPG. Survival horror and RPGs both have a heavy focus on resource management. They both start with the player character being weak to create a deliberate feeling of disempowerment, and they both involve gameplay that is more about strategic thinking than difficult to execute action. These genres aren't diametrically opposed, they sit side by side, and there's no reason to believe there should be no room in that Venn diagram for some overlap. Finally, if RPGs and horror shouldn't mix, then what about action and horror? Action is far more dependent on empowerment than RPGs, and that hasn't stopped that specific incompatible mix from producing some of the most acclaimed games ever made. Horror can be many things, and if you will allow me to be a little controversial here, horror being scary is probably overrated. A game with great gameplay and a great story that is occasionally scary feels far more impressive than a game that is regularly scary but has no other substance. The best horror movies are not always the scariest, and there is a proud tradition of horror being, at times, cheesy or camp or heavily mixed in with comedy. Horror is about many things. It can explore many emotions, and sometimes the appeal lies in the setting, the situations, and the problems faced, and what all these reveal about humanity. All things, RPGs are a perfect vessel to explore. Horror and role-playing aren't just compatible, they make a great combination. So, why hasn't it actually worked out that way in gaming? Where are all the great horror RPGs? The tabletop RPG Call of Cthulhu released in 1981 and immediately stood out thanks to its decreased focus on combat, innovative sanity system, and relatively grounded 1920s setting. Still, what made Chaosium's soon-to-be flagship title truly different was how it replaced the heroic adventurers of other games with normal people. Normal people sharing a world with potentially very abnormal entities, inspired by the works of H.P. Lovecraft and Who Said Normal People Have to Investigate, but still, normal people, with all of the fragility and flaws normality entails, and no player character plot armor to protect them. Call of Cthulhu embraced horror wholeheartedly, in both setting and mechanics, with even successful encounters against otherworldly entities coming at a serious cost in sanity, and many campaigns ending in death or total madness. And so, it was something fresh and exciting, and became an immediate critical and commercial success, meaning many other horror tabletop RPGs followed, with emphasis on the many part of that statement. This would include Dungeons & Dragons itself with the release of its gothic horror Ravenloft campaign setting, as well as Vampire the Masquerade in 1991. This was the first in White Wolf's World of Darkness series, which found great success in the 90s and early 2000s and set itself apart by allowing players to take the role of the monsters of a horror setting rather than just their potential victims. Yet, video game RPGs would be noticeably slower to embrace horror. Probably because, as the last video I made illustrated, video games themselves were slow to embrace horror. Console games were widely seen as for children, and PC games took time to work out how to successfully implement horror-focused gameplay. Still, signs of a union between the two genres always existed, lurking in the dark dungeons of early RPGs, where danger was a constant companion, and monster designs borrowed extensively from horror media. Few games show this as strongly as esteemed computer RPG grandfather, Wizardry, which was renowned for its unforgiving difficulty that ensured death came fast and frequent. If Wizardry's simple Apple II visuals fail to portray any inclination towards horror by today's standards, You only have to look at its later releases to see just how dark its take on dark fantasy could be, and how its endless labyrinthine dungeons could evoke feelings of isolation and dread. The game's wizardry went on to inspire were many, and included the first wave of console RPGs on the NES, like Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, and Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei, which in turn would lead to Capcom's Sweet Home in 1989, whose role in creating Resident Evil is likely well known by this point. Sweet Home does deserve further attention, but it's important to understand that despite its reputation as a unique and groundbreaking survival horror progenitor, it wasn't alone in bridging the horror JRPG divide. For example, 1987 saw the release of Shuryo Sensen War of the Dead on the MSX, a Zelda 2-like action RPG about stopping a demon invasion that featured overworld exploration and side-on battle screens, as well as La Place Nomar on the PC-88, which featured the familiar first-person dungeon crawling and turn-based battles of wizardry, as well as a lot of influence from the Call of Cthulhu RPG, including its 1920s New England setting, its sanity meter acting as a secondary health system, and its atypical character classes, like detective, scientist, and journalist. In fact, there are so many similarities, some might consider this plagiarism. But it was undeniably a horror game, with enemies even giving minimal XP to prevent overleveling, and combat regularly being avoidable and used as a punishment for failure. Meanwhile, Jarseiken Necromancer for the PC Engine even had cover art by H.R. Geiger. Otherwise, it's apparently a quite typical Dragon Quest clone with a heavy horror theme and some great monster designs. I mean, I may not be able to read any text in this game due to the lack of an English translation, but I'm sure everyone can appreciate a well-animated intestine wriggle when they see one. And look at that blood spurt. Not bad for 1988. There are still plenty of Japanese games from this era that remain shrouded in obscurity. It's all well and good if you go on to create the most famous horror series in gaming, but not every unlocalized game did something like that. Still, if you want proof that horror and RPG can work together, Sweet Home does provide considerable testimony. On the surface, this was another Dragon Quest clone, this time focused on a group of amateur filmmakers who become trapped in a mysterious mansion inhabited by supernatural enemies. Yet the game would feature many elements that became core survival horror features, including a limited inventory, puzzle solving, and the need to switch between the game's 5 party members to utilize their unique skills as you explore the mansion. Limited visuals might limit some of the horror for modern audiences, but Sweet Home does try to create tension. Random encounters and limited saving create danger. Party members die permanently when defeated. Vision is sometimes restricted. Healing can only be done through finding tonics, which there is a finite number of, and there are even rudimentary jump scares, complete with QuickTime events the player needs to hastily react to. Sweet Home was more than just the game that led to Resident Evil. It was a competent horror game in its own right, and the main reason it wasn't localized is believed to be because its horror imagery was considered too gruesome for Nintendo of America, not because it was too niche. But lead to Resident Evil it did, which in turn provided an effective template for other horror games to copy that didn't rely on RPG systems. Meanwhile, outside Japan, the graphical adventure games that Alone in the Dark originated from were regularly dabbling with horror narratives, and had been for many years by this point. This era is often seen as the golden age for the adventure genre, and in this age of abundance, adventure games had started to merge with RPGs by lifting their stat systems and combat. And some of these hybrids were horror games. Elvira, Mistress of the Dark was a 1988 movie, adapted into a 1990 video game by Horrorsoft, and featuring the titular Elvira, a stage persona famous for hosting a weekly horror movie show. The game has you explore a haunted mansion with one-on-one combat and some impressive sprite work. Elvira would also receive a sequel in 1991. Other examples include Veil of Darkness in 1993, where a pilot crash lands in a remote Romanian village ruled by an evil, not Dracula vampire. Combat was real-time and heavily mouse-based, somewhat like an early Diablo, but gameplay was heavily adventure game, with enemies not giving XP to disincentivize combat. Or Bloodnet, also from 1993 and also featuring vampires, but this time in a futuristic cyberpunk setting, and instead of defeating not Dracula, you have to defeat actual Van Helsing. The player takes the role of a newly turned vampire who has to manage both a bloodlust and humanity level in an otherwise heavily stat and skill-based point-and-click adventure. Western dungeon crawlers would also embrace horror, like with 1992's Waxworks, a real-time first-person game in the vein of Dungeon Master. Waxworks featured a cursed protagonist forced to traverse dungeons from different time periods, where upon completing each dungeon, their level and items are completely reset to ensure they always started off weak and disempowered. And like Horrorsoft's earlier work, it once more featured some impressive graphical gore. Or the legacy Realm of Terror from 1993, which was a similar first-person real-time dungeon crawler set in another haunted mansion, but with a heavy emphasis on resource management. Healing items were scarce, with the player needing to rely on infrequent safe areas where they can rest up, but resting increased hunger, and the low inventory limit forced players to regularly have to weigh the value of certain items over others to create a stressful experience where resources were always dwindling. There were also multiple Ravenloft dungeon crawlers, starting with Strahd's Possession in 1994, which thoroughly embraced the horror atmosphere of their setting and once more featured first-person, real-time gameplay. But then, computer RPGs hit their mid-90s apocalypse and faced near extinction. If you want to know more about that, check my RPG history video, but the result was the era of diverse and relatively modest budget titles gave way to a more concentrated genre of fewer but bigger hits, often with very different core gameplay. This is what produced Fallout, Diablo, and Baldur's Gate, and so horror was cast back to the shadows. Or was it? Fallout, Diablo, and the Infinity Engine RPGs are not horror games, but it would be wrong to say there was no horror in them. For example, the first Fallout had almost none of the levity the series would go on to become famous for. Instead, its depiction of the post-apocalypse was desolate and depressing. Locations like the eerily abandoned Vault 15, the ghoul-filled City of the Dead, Necropolis, or the radiated ruins of a research facility that took a direct hit from a nuclear bomb, known now simply as the Glow, are fantastic horror locations. Particularly that last one, which doesn't just feature an unnerving, dread-inducing atmosphere, but also acts as a reminder of the very real horrors of nuclear war, while also forcing players to take continuous radiation damage, making every second inside agonizing as you descend deeper and deeper with no way of knowing when you'll find what you're searching for, or if your Rad X supplies will be enough. This is your annual reminder to play Fallout 1. You know, you're not actually allowed to complain about Bethesda not understanding Fallout unless you have played this game yourself. Sorry, I don't make the rules. Meanwhile, the Infinity Engine games include the deeply hostile and atmospheric dungeons of Icewind Dale, which almost all featured some form of ancient evil, or the pervasive unfamiliarity of Planescape Torment, a game where the player wakes with total amnesia amidst the corpses of a morgue, and then explores a dark alien setting featuring plenty of horror themes. In fact, I don't know a better example of a one-paragraph horror story than the Tale of the Third Wish, told by your companion Mort, which you can pause the video and read now if you want, but you should really just play the game yourself, maybe straight after you finish Fallout. And finally, there is Diablo, a game famous for the series it created, a series that is all about min-maxing, loot drops, and being very, very sweaty. But forget the rest of this series, because this isn't what made Diablo 1 successful.
Fresh meat.
Horror imagery and atmosphere were a big part of the first Diablo and remain one of its most praised qualities. And so, even when dedicated horror RPGs disappeared, horror was still there, and in some ways it could feel even more effective as it was used in small doses that didn't grow familiar through constant repetition. Horror dungeon crawlers also persisted, just more so in Japan. Kingsfield has become quite well known these days due to its later spiritual successors, Demon Souls and Dark Souls, but for those unaware, Kingsfield was a series of first-person dungeon crawlers with true action combat that sheds the grid-based movement of Dungeon Master likes. This can make Kingsfield seem a bit like a Japanese take on Ultima Underworld, but its main inspiration has always been said to be wizardry, which is reflected in its pitch-dark fantasy setting. Kingsfield's commitment to minimal player instructions and a lonely, foreboding atmosphere could already make it horror-adjacent, particularly in its fourth and final mainline entry, The Ancient City, but From Software would also release two very similar games in Shadow Tower. If you're more familiar with FromSoft's later work, Shadow Tower was to Kingsfield what Bloodborne was to Dark Souls, but even this may undersell just how committed to horror Shadow Tower truly was. The draw distance was lowered dramatically, equipment lost durability quickly and thus regularly broke, the often pleasant ambient soundtrack of Kingsfield was replaced with uncomforting silence with no in-game music to break it up, and the story unraveled entirely in a single fixed location, the eponymous tower in which the player is trapped with no escape or respite. Shadow Tower was a slow, dangerous descent into hell, crafted to be as oppressive as possible, and its emphasis on disempowerment and tension through game mechanics is probably enough to consider it as survival horror. In 2003, it would receive a sequel in Shadow Tower Abyss, which maintained the horror dungeon crawling gameplay in an even stranger and more surreal setting. Abyss is considered by some to be the pinnacle of From Software's dungeon crawlers, although its Japanese-only release limited its influence. Yet, From Software weren't the only Japanese RPG developer experimenting with horror. Baroque has only recently gained more attention after an English fan translation released some 25 years later, and combined real-time dungeon crawling with roguelike permadeath, procedural generation, and horror. In it, the player has a vitality meter in addition to health that continually decreases unless the player keeps killing and consuming the flesh of enemies to create an emphasis on resource management. Its strange post-apocalyptic setting and biblically infused cryptic story helped it to become a cult classic in Japan. Other unlocalized Japanese horror RPGs of this era could be similarly strange, even if in entirely different ways. But there were horror JRPGs which did get Western releases. Released in 1998, Parasite Eve was a product of Squaresoft's famed Golden Run and featured plenty of golden developers, including Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi, Chrono Trigger co-director Takashi Takita, Final Fantasy character artist Tetsuya Nomura, and Kingdom Hearts composer Yoko Shimomura. The result was one of the PlayStation's best-selling RPGs. Not named Final Fantasy, anyway. Parasite Eve was based on a Japanese sci-fi horror novel of the same name, and revolved around disaster striking modern-day New York when a powerful creature called Eve begins manipulating the mitochondria inside living beings to take them over from the inside, turning them into a wide range of grotesque body horror monsters, wonderfully captured by once cutting-edge FMV. It's these monster designs that fuel much of the game's horror, alongside the unnerving, if scientifically questionable concept of mitochondria acting as parasitic sleeper agents inside all eukaryotic beings, waiting to one day take over their hosts and enact their millennia-long resentment. And yes, I did just copy the word eukaryote from the mitochondrian Wikipedia page because I wanted to sound clever. Parasite Eve's story leans heavily into camp B-movie horror alongside more Hollywood-inspired action set pieces, and it's these cinematic aspirations that likely explain this genre mashup's creation. The game feels like an attempt to combine Final Fantasy VII's bombastic, critically acclaimed presentation with tighter, more movie-like pacing. The result is impressively original, with the pseudo-turn-based combat of PS1 Final Fantasy games copied but made more real-time and immersive, with the player able to move around mid-battle to dodge attacks, and with all combat taking place on the field map rather than a separate battle screen. The modern-day setting also helped ground the action, with the player using a range of guns and psychic powers as they pursued Eve across an abandoned and atmospheric New York. Given its high sales and enduring fanbase, it would be hard to argue Parasite Eve's experimentation wasn't a success, and yet for players looking exclusively for horror, it would also be hard to argue Parasite Eve matches many of the PS1's more celebrated horror games. It was maybe for this reason that the 1999 sequel made so many changes. If the first Parasite Eve was a horror story combined with RPG gameplay, the second is a traditional survival horror game with some RPG upgrade systems. In fact, with most of the first game developers moving on to different projects, development was instead headed by Resident Evil 1 writer Kenichi Iwao, and the similarities to Resident Evil are abundant. Both narratively, with the story now involving an evil corporation messing with unethical viruses, and mechanically, with new tank controls and full real-time combat. Because of this, Parasite Eve 2 is a less unique game, even if it was able to produce tension more effectively through its claustrophobic and challenging combat encounters. It will also employ the classic Resident Evil trick of using specific camera choices to limit player vision and keep enemies off-screen, and featured another set of memorable monster designs, this time more homunculus in nature with animals mixed with humanoid features, but still suitably unnerving. Yet, it also questions at what point does a horror RPG just become a horror game? Because if the only thing making Parasite Eve 2 an RPG is gaining an XP-like currency from defeating enemies to spend on upgrades, that could apply to other horror games too, and the world doesn't need "is Resident Evil 4 an RPG" discussions. Luckily, Parasite Eve wasn't the only horror RPG to escape Japan, as another group of Square developers, led by Hiroki Kikuta, would break away to form their own company, Saknoff, for the specific purpose of creating just such a game. The result was Koudelka, which released in late 1999 and provided a rather different take on this concept. Set in 1898 in a remote Welsh monastery, Koudelka's dark, detailed pre-renders and single-location exploration immediately bring to mind Resident Evil. Its story would also buck PS1 RPG trends by being fully voice-acted, with its three main characters, who become unlikely allies as they explore the monastery, delivering strong performances throughout. What differentiated Koudelka most from both Resident Evil and other JRPGs was its combat. Battles triggered through random encounters and took place on a grid-based map. To fit with its horror ambitions, all melee weapons had limited durability, and guns limited ammo. Although the game is so generous with these, as well as every other resource, that this struggles to have the intended effect. Battles were also glacially slow, which in a linear game, like many other JRPGs, wouldn't be such a problem, but Koudelka is structured much more like a survival horror game. In it, the player must thoroughly explore and solve puzzles in the monastery, which involved frequent backtracking and double-checking environments for easily missable items. I mean, the backgrounds might look great, but it's not exactly easy to see what can and can't be interacted with here, and even if you never miss anything, puzzles still send you back and forth all over this place. Still, despite some problems, Koudelka remains an interesting take on the genre, and 2 years later, it too would receive a sequel. Shadow Hearts released early in the PlayStation 2's life, and would once more provide a new take on the horror RPG concept. This time though, Saknoff played it safe, by sticking to a largely conventional JRPG battle system and structure, which now took players all across early 20th century Asia and Europe. The story also saw a tone shift, with the seriousness of Koudelka now accompanied by more dark comedy and exaggerated weirdness. Regardless, Shadow Hearts' story maintained a heavy horror focus, and it proved successful enough to receive further sequels, with Shadow Hearts Covenant releasing in 2004 and making vast improvements to gameplay, story, and presentation. Yet, despite this, Covenant moved even further from its horror origins, before the next sequel abandoned them altogether. Meanwhile, in the West, horror RPGs would also find success before seemingly being abandoned. In 1999, System Shock 2 released to universal acclaim and built on the immersive sim design of its 1994 predecessor by adding in role-playing systems. The game begins with the player choosing their character's career, between the combat-focused Marine, technically skilled Navy officer, or psionically apt OSA agent, before further career choices determine their starting skill set. In this way, the game maintained its immersive sim goal of being immersive by presenting its character systems and choices as diegetic parts of its game world, with further upgrades represented by players acquiring cyber modules or making upgrades to their operating system. And yet, System Shock 2 also committed to making choices matter, with players potentially unable to even use basic guns at the game's outset, and a skill system that rewarded specialization, ensuring some options would inevitably remain out of reach. This complemented the immersive sim level design, which aimed to present multiple solutions to problems and ensured strong replayability. System Shock 2 was also competent at horror. Its premise of a lone soldier aboard a spaceship trapped in the midst of a struggle for control between the hyper-advanced AI gone rogue Shodan and the unnerving biological hive mind, the Many, was highly memorable. Its use of audio diaries to organically explain the game's backstory would also go on to be heavily influential, while being particularly effective for a horror game that wants to keep the player character isolated. And the balancing of many resources, including the need to regularly repair weapons, also heightened tension. It's also worth noting that for a 90s RPG, System Shock 2 was also a pretty solid FPS. If there's one obvious criticism to make of the game, other than the ending cutscene, it's that the very standard PC game ability to save your game anytime, anywhere, including in combat, massively cut through the tension of a game aspiring to horror. There is a reason the term save scumming carries negative connotations, and it's because an overuse of the ability to save and load to produce the best results can cheapen the intended sense of difficulty and rob choices of their consequences. Sometimes games are better when you have to play out your mistakes, make do with what resources you have available, and live with your bad decisions. And save scumming can potentially rob players of some of their own enjoyment through what would otherwise be an optimal way to play a game if the objective is just to win. Of course, people should be free to play however they want, and being able to save at any time brings significant quality of life benefit, but just the term save scumming acts as a reminder that there is a downside to this, even if it's one you decide is worth it. Except, this is all in the context of RPGs. In RPGs, save scumming can be a problem. In horror games, it is simply antithetical to the objectives of horror. If you're always safe from the consequences of unoptimal play, you are always safe. And if you're always safe, it's not horror. In 1999, survival horror was still a relatively new genre that was largely centered on console games. The PC gaming standard was to allow saving at any time, and changing this wasn't an obvious thing to do and would have been against audience expectations. This may even be part of the reason horror seemed to find more success on consoles than PCs. Yet PC horror RPGs didn't disappear entirely. Not only did later games like Arx Fatalis or The Temple of Elemental Evil continue to produce moments of effective horror through limiting it to small doses, but the PC would also get one final horror RPG before the era of console domination took hold. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, released in 2004 as the final game from the short-lived but highly influential developer Troika Games. As an adaptation of the tabletop RPG, it maintained a wide breadth of role-playing options, including a choice of 7 different vampire clans that could radically change your playstyle. The deformed-looking Nosferatu, for example, must avoid being seen by mortals, forcing them to rely on stealth and sewer systems to get around, while the seemingly insane Malkavians were, as they seemed, insane. and so had completely rewritten dialogue options that had to be deciphered like cryptic crossword clues. The skill system also allowed for completely different builds. Quests involved frequent choices and often had multiple solutions, which incorporated non-violent stealth and persuasion options, and strong writing brought the seedy, modern-day take on LA to life, while injecting even the most throwaway NPCs with a distinct sense of personality rarely matched in gaming. In short, it was, and still is, a great RPG that was let down by its poor action combat and extensive bugs. Bloodlines was famously rushed to release by a developer facing financial ruin and a publisher calling all the shots on the release date. In fact, Activision's role goes even further, as they didn't just fail to give the game more time, they actually pulled the game forward, changing the planned spring 2005 release date to November 16th, 2004, which just so happened to be the exact same day as Half-Life 2, forcing Bloodlines to compete against the biggest PC blockbuster of the decade. The result was a hugely promising game that was basically unfinished and marred with technical issues. Troika Games closed down 3 months later, with fans instead stepping up to the role of patching the game, which ultimately created one of the greatest cult classic RPGs in gaming. But it's all well and good lamenting the involvement of Activision or singing the praise of Bloodlines as an RPG. How was it as a horror game? Well, it wasn't bad. Bloodlines is one of the best examples of how horror can be effective in small doses, as most of the game makes little attempt to scare the player. This makes the other sections, like the Ocean House Hotel or Dr. Grout's Insane Asylum, deeply unfamiliar, as the usual rules and safety the player has grown used to get turned on their head. Ocean House, for example, completely isolates the player and features no combat, meaning the usual tools of guns, fists, stealth, and dialogue options are no help against your unseen foe. And yet, this isn't the only reason Bloodlines stands out as a great horror RPG. A lot of horror games let you play as a victim, but Bloodlines let you play as the monster. This is what made the tabletop game so successful, and it's just as enjoyable in video game form. Vampire the Masquerade's world revolves around the Masquerade, which is a set of rules governing vampire behavior that ensures their existence isn't revealed to humanity. As vampires rely on humans for sustenance, it's in vampires' interests that humans remain ignorant of them and thus subservient, although plenty of vampires disagree with these rules. This world building helps ground the myriad different characters and factions the player encounters. Usual moral binaries and categories are upended, allowing the player to approach each person and situation individually. How you navigate this immoral existence and immoral world is left up to you, and this made Bloodlines feel like a breath of fresh air. You can have fun living out your depraved vampire fantasies, or find even greater meaning in trying to do good in such a dark world, or get involved in vampire politics, or wallow in self-pity because
I never asked for this.
There are 2 main reasons horror RPGs work. One is because RPG systems can achieve horror goals. The other is because horror scenarios create fun options for role-playing, and these are options that other horror games often ignore because they're so fixated on the need to scare the player. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines is the perfect example of the value of the latter. And yet, this still wasn't enough. Bloodlines did not finally prove the importance of horror RPGs to the masses or pave the way for other great games to come. Nor did System Shock, or Parasite Eve, or Shadow Hearts, or any other game mentioned so far. Instead, as the 2000s continued, horror RPGs largely disappeared. When the HD generation arrived, many genres found themselves falling out of fashion amidst the overwhelming popularity of shooters and action games. This didn't only include horror RPGs, but also most of survival horror and traditional RPGs in general. And if big genres like this couldn't survive, what chance did the more niche combination of the two have? And yet, after considerable time, some developers would return to the idea. In fact, after almost 14 years of no mainstream attempt at a horror RPG, 3 different takes on the concept would all end up arriving in the space of a year. The first was Vampire, a game that 7 years later, I'm still not quite sure how to pronounce, from Life is Strange developer Don't Nod Entertainment. Vampire provided a very different take on role-playing as a vampire, this time amidst the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic and with little attempt at horror-focused gameplay, as its action combat regularly involved clearing entire groups of foes from the streets of London. Its main selling point, however, was its complicated web of NPC relations that the player could drastically impact. As a doctor-turned-vampire, the game's main dilemma centers on whether to follow your Hippocratic duties to save NPCs, or follow your late-night snack cravings by sucking them dry for substantial bonus XP. Killing one NPC can risk harming others, as consequences ripple out with entire districts falling to disease or other conflicts, meaning a smart bloodsucker probably wants to mix saving people with killing them to keep as many people alive for as long as possible to make sure they're available to be feasted on later. This doctor-vampire conflict does present a novel dichotomy, but it hardly constitutes much depth for role-playing. The game is basically just asking the simple moral binary of do you want to be good or bad that many other non-horror games have asked before it. In other ways, Vampire impresses with its atmosphere and presentation, yet its limited budget still leaves it struggling to compete with true AAA titles, which is something that also applies to the other 2 big modern horror RPGs. Call of Cthulhu is an adaptation of Call of Cthulhu, the RPG, not the short story, although you'd be forgiven for not realizing that because there is little about this game that feels like an RPG. The exception is the skill system, which determines how the player can investigate various Lovecraftian going-ons. The chance-based skill checks this leads to, however, just provide different means to the same ends, with the actual game playing out very linearly, and few choices feeling like they matter outside of determining the game's ending. These light RPG elements are accompanied by bad forced stealth sections and one single, somehow even worse, combat section, and all of these feel shoehorned in to provide any form of gameplay to avoid the label of walking sim, which didn't work. You might defend Call of Cthulhu by saying it's all about the story, and if your criteria for a good horror story is to include as many different well-known Lovecraftian elements as possible in as little time as possible, Call of Cthulhu is one of the best. If your criteria instead involves having a good story, it is not. But at least it made for an easy act to follow. Although you'd be forgiven for confusing The Sinking City as being the same act. Both games share a 1920s New England setting, both feature their own version of Innsmouth and a main story about Cthulhu, both have a middle-aged, grizzled war veteran turned private investigator protagonist with a substance abuse problem. Hang on a second, that's a bit specific, surely. I'm not falling for this again. These are the same game. Wait, no, this one has a janky open world, too much combat, and much more involved and impressive detective systems. Now I remember. But they do share an origin. Sinking City developer Frogware was actually the original developer for Call of Cthulhu, before a breakup with publisher Focus Home Interactive late in development caused them to hand the project to Cyanide Studio, with Frogware finishing their game on their own. And despite aesthetic and narrative similarities, the 2 games actually play quite differently, as The Sinking City is dominated by its large open world setting, making it feel like a much more ambitious title. Unfortunately, Frogware struggled to live up to this ambition, and technical and pacing problems bring the experience down almost to the depths of the previous game. The worst part of these titles, however, is simply that the horror feels stale. Lovecraft once said, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. It is a shame then that those he inspired rarely adhere to this principle, because both of these games feature no unknowns. Instead, they feel like greatest hits collections played by an inexperienced cover band whose lead singer had rather too much to drink. The enthusiasm is there, and these are the same songs you're familiar with, but you're still left feeling that you probably should have just stayed at home. And here, I guess, is where history becomes the present. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2, the most promising horror RPG in years, looms on the horizon, ready to put all historical wrongs finally to right. After years of development problems, including the exodus of all key staff and a complete change of developer, and with previews describing the game as not much of an RPG, and with 2 of the game's 6 clans locked behind day 1 DLC that currently costs $30. So, yeah, sounds like we're fucked to me. It might be tempting to look at this story so far and walk away thinking horror RPGs were but a failed experiment. A product from a time when games were willing to take risks and try something new, and that this specific risk just didn't work, causing the genre to disappear for good reason. And there is some truth to that. Horror RPGs weren't in the gaming mainstream for long, and they didn't find much success. Sure, Parasite Eve was one of the PS1's best-selling RPGs, but other games mentioned here didn't replicate this. System Shock 2 is one of the greatest games of all time, according to the Wikipedia page, but do you know what else it is? One of the games you are most likely to see on a list of great games that flopped. System Shock 2 received universal acclaim and sold fewer than 100,000 units in its first year. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines was Troika's worst-selling game and ended the company. Koudelka may have kept Saknov alive for a sequel, but they were still acquired in 2002 and defunct less than 10 years later. Shadow Tower was not the game to bring From Software mainstream success. Baroque's eventual English release did not go well, and even Parasite Eve didn't create a successful series. The second game changed much and sold worse, and the third game was considered so disappointing by fans that I haven't even mentioned it in this video. But this isn't the whole story. For one thing, these games may not have sold well, but you have heard of them. And I bet there are many RPGs that sold well over 100,000 units that you haven't heard of. Whatever game I choose to show here, there's going to be someone thinking, but everyone knows that game. And stop. Don't try and act like fucking Summoner is as well known these days as System Shock 2 or Bloodlines. Horror RPGs are remembered. Sales are important, but are we really going to act like the impression a game leaves on its player base or its influence on the industry isn't also relevant? Without System Shock 2, there'd be no BioShock. Without From Software's experiments with mixing horror with dungeon crawling, there'd be no Dark Souls. And without the horror of Diablo 1, Diablo 3 wouldn't have sold over 30 million copies. These games mattered. And horror RPGs weren't the only genre to see a decline in the 2000s. Survival horror almost died. Tabletop-inspired RPGs basically did die, and even JRPGs, a genre once topping sales records, looked in danger of extinction. And this all happened in the same period. As the HD generation arrived, video game budgets increased, and developers flocked to the safest and most mass appeal genres and series. Anything that wasn't mainstream struggled to attract funding, and horror RPGs were just another example. In fact, horror games in particular likely struggled as a result of this shift towards accessibility. Horror wants to make players uncomfortable. Limited saves, limited resources, severe punishments, none of these fit with the broader evolution of gaming in this period. But there aren't just macro explanations. These games also had individual problems. Survival horror was a new concept in the 90s, and games which combined it with RPG systems were treading new ground. Ideas are rarely perfected on their first attempt. System Shock 2's tension was hurt by its save system, but few would have thought to limit player saving in a PC RPG in 1999. Parasite Eve was far too generous with its resources. You would struggle to run out of ammo in this game even if you tried, and the constantly recharging Parasite energy points can translate to a constant source of free healing. Koudelka was somehow even more generous, with both save points and level ups granting a full heal, combat difficulty being generally low, and so many resources dropping from enemies that the only risk fighting brings is turning you into an accidental hoarder who no longer has space for key items. Sometimes good design requires iteration. These titles never had that chance, as even when they did get sequels or successors, they just changed things rather than improving what was already there. Meanwhile, Bloodlines was literally released before it was ready, which just so happened to be on the same day as Half-Life 2, and Bloodlines is hardly the only horror RPG with a troubled development. Frogware were kicked off their game. Cyanide had to pick up another developer's pieces, and none of these more recent examples were from experienced RPG developers, nor did these games appear to have large budgets. Troubled developments create troubled games, and Bloodlines 2 looks to be just another example, because my god, that game has had a troubled development. But this isn't a failing of the genre. It's the same failure that happens to all sorts of other games. And maybe horror RPGs have just been unlucky. Sometimes it only takes one game to prove a concept works, and then everyone else becomes willing to copy. But if the proof never arrives, most are too scared to try, which can become a reinforcing cycle. So the history of horror RPGs might read like a failed experiment, but there were mitigating circumstances. These games had incredible potential, and when there were problems, it almost always lay with the execution, not the idea. In short, horror RPGs deserved better. But maybe their day has finally arrived. After Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, attempts to make mainstream horror RPGs largely ended, and yet somehow this combination of genres still kept showing up. STALKER: Oblivion Lost was announced in 2001 as an ambitious hybrid of FPS and RPG gameplay. It was inspired by Half-Life, Deus Ex, and System Shock, and the dystopic Russian sci-fi novel Roadside Picnic, and its 1979 movie adaptation, Stalker. Oblivion Lost's development stretched long enough that it was once considered vaporware, and yet, in late 2007, it finally released as Stalker: Shadow of Chernobyl. Shadow of Chernobyl mixed several genres, and today the description that might come to mind for such a game is an open-world survival game. But survival is a fairly recent term, pushed into people's gaming lexicon by the likes of Minecraft and the original DayZ. Survival games show similarities to survival horror, in that survival is both a thematic objective and mechanical challenge, and to RPGs, in that abstracted systems are used to simulate or represent many of the gameplay elements linked to this, like hunger meters and gamified crafting. But survival did turn out to be an important bridge in a handful of games that would otherwise surely be considered prime examples of horror RPGs. Like Stalker, whose irradiated and reality-distorting Chernobyl exclusion zone setting is perfect for horror. A lot of Stalker's runtime is spent in quiet isolation as you wander its world, creating plenty of atmospheric build-up for its rarer moments of real terror. The horror is helped by a sense of unpredictability, both from the dangerous anomalies that characterize the exclusion zone and from the sandbox game design that leaves players unsure where exploration will take them and what will be waiting there. It's on the RPG side where Stalker feels a little lighter. There's no XP, leveling, or traditional character building, although artifacts you scavenge and equip do provide various bonuses, and survival-style item management provides plenty of gear progression. Dialogue also features some choices, and side quests are plentiful, but what really makes Stalker stand out as a horror RPG is its openness. This game puts you in the shoes of an explorer of this harsh and hostile world, and leaves how you navigate this danger up to you. Should you take this fight or avoid it? Kill other humans for loot, or leave potential allies in good standing? Indulge your curiosity by going off the beaten path, or respect the dangers of the wasteland? It's this immersive sandbox side of the experience that other horror games rarely provide. Like other horror RPGs before it, Stalker became a cult classic, despite many bugs and technical problems, and would go on to spawn numerous sequels, fan mods, and now even a shiny numbered sequel, which only took 14 years from its announcement to release, although I'm sure the illegal invasion of Ukraine didn't exactly help with that. However, Stalker was far from the only survival game that could be viewed as a horror RPG. Pathologic released in 2005, only in Russian, before releasing in English in 2006, although the translation was meant to be poor. Still, in Russian it won plenty of awards, and it later received an updated version with updated English in 2015. This was followed by a remake/reboot in 2019's Pathologic 2, which the Steam description does actually describe as an open-world horror RPG. And this description feels apt. Pathologic is about survival. Its setting is surreal, its story is confusing, and its main gameplay is walking from one place to another, but it's still always about survival. In Pathologic, a plague has struck a remote early 20th century town, bringing death, superstition, and panic that the player has to navigate as they try, largely in vain, to stop the plague's destructive influence. This involves managing hunger, exhaustion, and immunity meters, while scavenging or bartering for food, equipment, and medicine, and interacting with many NPCs and their many conflicting requests. There are no designated good or evil choices in Pathologic, although there's certainly plenty of bad choices. Ultimately though, the plague is always depicted as something greater than the player, and much of both the horror and role-playing of Pathologic comes from being at the mercy of this plague. This idea is more clearly realized in Pathologic 2, where the player always takes the role of a doctor tasked with treating the townsfolk, creating a feeling of familiarity and responsibility for the many people you probably won't be able to save. This makes Pathologic feel like a disaster simulator. You will witness the town and its people fall all around you, and be forced to carry the full weight of this nightmare as you go, creating effective psychological horror that is only enhanced by the setting's pervasive unfamiliarity. If horror RPGs are paths to interesting problems and scenarios, Pathologic 2 is a perfect example of this. In a setting so hopelessly bleak, every action must be considered carefully, as consequences always feel like they matter. For example, do you use your limited medicine to cure the sick, or save it in case you need to cure yourself? Are you willing to murder and steal to get valuable items you need to try to develop a cure for the plague? Who do you trust? Who do you save? And whose lives are you willing to just leave up to fate? The result is a compelling experience, and it's not compelling because of the quality of the gameplay. In fact, some might say Pathologic's success was very much in spite of its gameplay. Instead, Pathologic's greatness is that it lets you roleplay within a horror setting. This game is never really that scary in a traditional sense, but it does make sure you feel its horror. Still, if you do want something scary, released in 2017, Darkwood is a survival horror game with emphasis on survival, about a man trapped inside a nightmarish forest. While the top-down perspective might look unusual, the limited field of view cleverly creates tension, making you often hear threats before you see them, and introducing constant paranoia and uncertainty about what might be nearby. In Darkwood, players must explore and scavenge during the day, before barricading themselves inside somewhere at night, praying that whatever's outside leaves you alone so you can make it to another morning. Acquiring more resources makes up a large part of this cycle, but the player can also level up through finding hallucinogens that grant beneficial traits, as well as some less beneficial ones. That said, Darkwood is heavier on the horror side than the RPG one, even if there are a number of choices the player makes when interacting with NPCs and during the main story. Still, when a horror game puts enough emphasis on survival, it's naturally pulled towards RPG design, which is surely a sign of compatibility between the genres of horror and role-playing. It doesn't seem that either Stalker, Pathologic, or Darkwood were born out of a desire to make a good horror RPG. Instead, their use of this intersection seems to be just a means to achieve other intended goals. All three games seek to immerse players in a particular horror setting or situation, be it radiated wasteland, a town gripped by a plague, or a very dark wood. And RPG elements either increase this immersion or increase player agency, with choice and consequence largely used not as a reward, but as a threat. And so, choices become burdens to endure, and consequences become something to be feared, while the needs of both horror and RPGs are met. Even horror games themselves have become more RPG-like in recent years. The Evil Within featured a heavy emphasis on crafting and even a skill tree, but The Evil Within 2 went considerably further with an extensive open-world design that introduced non-linearity, extensive upgrades, and plenty of side quests. Resident Evil has also introduced moments of narrative choice and more open design, alongside the continued focus on equipment progression, and in Resident Evil 4 Remake, even equipable charms to create a perk system. This is not me saying these games are RPGs, but rather that the genres have never been as far removed from each other as some might believe, and if horror games can be RPG-like, and RPGs can include horror, why should horror RPGs be uniquely unviable? Indie games have also produced other examples of these genres mixing. Now, despite being a fan, I would not personally consider Darkest Dungeon to be an RPG, due to one of the defining qualities of an RPG being a personal sense of scale, and much like in other turn-based tactical games, Darkest Dungeon instead casts you as the hero's manager instead of the heroes. But the Steam store page calls it an RPG in both description and user tags, so I guess it's fine to talk about it here, and it does certainly have plenty of RPG elements. Darkest Dungeon is famed for its narrator, its punishing design, and how the narrator likes to remind you of its punishing design. But its most interesting feature is how it represents the psychological effects of adventuring. Heroes gain stress, defy orders, have breakdowns, and need to be regularly sent to the brothel to get drunk or find God before being manipulated back into the dungeons for another round of bacon harvesting. It's Darkest Dungeon's RPG systems that allow this often ignored part of horror to be tangibly represented. And this game also shows the impact of severe consequences. Sunless Sea is another example of horror and RPG working in tandem in a completely different type of game to any mentioned so far. But if you really want proof of these two genres' synergy, there is one recent game that stands above all others. RPG Maker has produced a lot of indie horror classics. It seems strange then, but almost none of them are actually RPGs. I guess horror RPGs have long carried a questionable reputation, and so, despite the name of the engine suggesting a suitability for making RPGs, developers wanting to create horror games have often simply turned their back on RPG systems. But not Fear and Hunger. There are many things that could be said about this game, and many that already have been. its reputation paints it as cruel, a game that hates the player, or just that RPG Maker game with lots and lots of dicks. And this reputation is accurate, but the one thing that doesn't seem to get mentioned very often is that Fear and Hunger is a well-designed RPG. It's not your typical RPG. There are no experience points. There is no leveling up. Enemies can die in 1 or 2 hits, so can the player. Every second in-game lowers both your hunger meter and sanity. This effect also occurs to your in-game character. Saving requires finding a bed and then flipping a coin, and if you lose this coin toss, not only are you not allowed to save, but you're also woken up from your slumber by a dangerous enemy encounter. You can lose limbs. This will probably happen often. Lose your arms and you can't hold items. Lose your legs and you'll have to crawl. Lose your eyes and the game goes dark. But you can still continue. In fact, there are many times this game lets you continue, even when perhaps you wouldn't want to. The average Fear and Hunger playthrough is just 3 hours long, but the average time to complete this game is more like 17. The 14-hour difference between these numbers is the result of failure. Lots and lots of failure. Death is frequent in this game, and even mistakes which don't lead to death can lead to a loss of progress. Fear and Hunger is not a roguelike, but mistakes can compound, to the point where starting a new game can feel like a viable strategy, because on a new character you can do things so much better. And yet, Fear and Hunger doesn't ask perfection, just persistence. You can save the game, and every time you do, you have license to experiment. This is how you make progress in the game. And Fear and Hunger does offer an incredible sense of progression. Just instead of your player character gaining experience points, it comes from the player gaining knowledge. You learn about enemies. You learn to avoid traps. You learn where to find allies and who not to trust. You learn to take advantage of abilities and to pay attention to items. You learn your way around these dungeons and just how many secrets they hold. Experience points aren't the point of an RPG, they're just a means to an end. They provide a reward and allow players to grow stronger. But knowledge can achieve these goals as well. And if anything, gaining knowledge feels more rewarding, more real, and more deserved. I mean, what even are experience points if not an abstracted representation of characters gaining knowledge? So this doesn't make Fear and Hunger less of an RPG, far from it, and the inability to grind your way to victory also works great for maintaining horror. Still, what Fear and Hunger really provides is an experience where every action feels like it matters. You are constantly being asked to weigh risks, to decide whether to keep pushing forwards or to retreat to try to make it back to a save point, whether to fight or flee, whether to spend resources now or save them for later, and even time wasted comes at the cost of hunger and sanity. Your actions always matter, and the optimal action in any situation is never obvious. But if you persist, you will learn, allowing you to go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. The result is a feeling of constant danger and tension, complemented by the pervasive dread-inducing atmosphere of a game you know will never show mercy, which all makes for great horror. There are good things about Fear and Hunger's story too, but good horror stories aren't that hard to find. Fear and Hunger feels so special because it succeeds at being both a horror game and an RPG, and because each of these aspects work together to complement each other. It is the horror RPG to prove the value of the genre once and for all. And no one paid any attention to it. Sure, it's YouTube famous now, but this game released in 2018. Its popularity didn't take off until early 2023, over 4 years later, and this was only because a series of YouTubers covered it. The greatest horror RPG of modern times. And for years, it couldn't even reach 20 concurrent players. Luckily, that didn't stop its solo dev Miro from making a sequel, but horror RPGs deserve better. Yet, for the first time in a long while, this might be starting to change. The last year seems to have brought a substantial increase in indie games wearing the horror RPG label proudly. The survival genre continues onwards, with STALKER 2 finally releasing, and Pathologic 3 hopefully just on the horizon. Early access title Stygian the Outer Gods looks like it might hopefully provide a better take on Lovecraftian horror than certain earlier titles. Action dungeon crawlers seem to be making a general resurgence, which has produced what's likely the most aggressively horrifying example of the genre in Labyrinth of the Demon King. Part Kingsfield, part Silent Hill, slightly crusty but very effective, Labyrinth embodies its retro inspirations with a 4:3 aspect ratio, but its resource management, punishing stamina system, and sheer hostility shows a strong understanding of survival horror. And even the more forgotten grid-based dungeon crawler has received a horror entry in Tower of Mask, which modernizes the combat and camera controls, but otherwise feels impressively faithful to its Dungeon Master-like inspiration. Finally, RPG Maker brought another acclaimed horror RPG in Look Outside, a creative take on stunning pixelated body horror and cosmic insignificance. Look Outside offers further proof that horror settings provide fun playgrounds to roleplay in. In it, a mysterious event turns anyone who looks outside into a grotesque monster. The player is thus stuck inside their apartment building, giving you a great reason to go scavenge supplies and check in on the neighbors. But you don't have to. You could stay in your apartment, passing the time playing video games and refusing to open the door to anyone that knocks. Food might run out, but you won't starve, and when the story's 15 days are up, you will complete the game as having survived. I wouldn't exactly say this leads to a happy ending, but you should see some of the others. In truth, this is hardly the best way to experience the game, but Look Outside does give you plenty of agency in choosing how to respond to its absurdist apocalypse, and the choices provided will have you second-guessing yourself on whom to trust, what exactly is safe, and how best to spend your time. If you've ever sat around listening to someone explain what they would do to survive a zombie apocalypse, you should realize that some of the fun in horror isn't just being scared, it's engaging with the weird what-ifs of an unusual situation. RPGs are a rare genre that can allow this engagement, and Look Outside never forgets that its appeal is connected to having fun with its premise. Early, tense horror sections that are given weight due to limited saving soon give way to a darkly comedic, Earthbound-esque adventure before the narrative finally returns to its horror roots with some of the most memorable cosmic horror writing you'll see in a game. Look Outside is not the scariest survival horror game you'll find, but it's a deeply enjoyable horror RPG that proves the value of horror beyond just generating fear. It also proves that Fear and Hunger's success was not a one-off. The future doesn't look that bright for horror RPGs, actually. Almost every game mentioned here comes from a solo or near-solo developer, and horror RPGs will probably remain an underrepresented niche that both players and developers are liable to overlook. But at least it looks like there will still be a future. In conclusion, horror RPGs are underrated. These genres can and have worked together to produce memorable horror games and memorable RPGs, offering unique opportunities for role-playing and unique explorations of horror settings. History has rarely been kind to this genre, yet it remains one of the most exciting areas of indie gaming, and one day a mainstream horror RPG may arrive to prove to the masses what they've been missing out on. That game might not be Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2. Troubled developments produce troubled games. But one day, maybe. Thank you for watching. This is the end of the video, but there is another new video on Expedition 33 and why I didn't love it, that you can watch on a new second channel that I guess I will link somewhere. I'm also going to be streaming over the next few weeks, Sunday to Thursday, starting at 6 UK time, probably on Twitch, so that subscribers on this channel aren't flooded with notifications. But I'll be honest, I don't really know what I'm doing right now. But I hope something works out, because streaming has been fun, and contrary to what you might expect, I think it's helped with video production, actually. After 7 years of making videos, I think maybe I need something new and different alongside it. This isn't the easy, effortless thing it used to be, and just trying to work lots and lots, i.e. my old strategy, hasn't been working as well this last year, as I found it difficult to stay motivated and productive. So I think streaming is maybe important to me. So if you want to watch me play and talk about games, my Twitch channel has literally 0 followers right now, so your support would mean a lot. I'll be playing Dark Messiah of Might and Magic and then Mother 3, both for the first time, because those are the games people voted for me to stream on Discord, and then maybe Hades 2, and very likely Bloodlines 2 next month on release, while I try to decide if I should make a video on it. There will probably be one last YouTube stream, and after that I'll just stream on Twitch, if Twitch works out at least, while also uploading VODs to YouTube on the new channel, I guess? I don't really know what I'll be doing actually, which is kind of a shame, because if I did know, I could tell you, and that would probably be helpful. More helpful than what I'm saying right now, anyway. But there you go, at least I have announced that I will be doing something.